Last season, despite the fact the Capitals were focused partially on an individual award, they put together one of the best regular seasons in the NHL. Now that Alex Ovechkin has the goal-scoring title and the Capitals can fully focus on winning, just how high can this team soar? This is the 2025-26 Deep Dive on the Washington Capitals. Hello and welcome to team number 8 on my preseason power rankings, which is ironic, the Washington Capitals. Like I said in the intro, the Capitals' attention last year seemed to be split, especially the closer Ovechkin got to the goal record. You could really tell the team was very much focused on getting him as many opportunities to score as possible. And he kind of talked about that, and some of the players talked about that as he got closer and closer to breaking the record. It became a very big discussion about like the distraction of it, like the media circus that was following the Capitals around, and everything got very much about Ovechkin. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this team reacts now that that's over, because now they can really just focus on being a very good team. And this was a team that I was pretty high on last offseason, and I felt validated in that because they put together the second best regular season in the NHL. Now that the expectations and the pressure of getting Ovechkin to pass Gretzky is over, you can really focus solely on this team being a legitimate contender. And I think they are a legitimate contender. Like I said, last year we saw it with them being the second best team in the regular season and obviously end up falling short to the Carolina Hurricanes. But like, this is a very, very good team, and it's a team that also has some young players who are coming up that are very exciting, right? Like, obviously, Ryan Leonard's the big one. But Connor McMichael having another year under his belt is going to be another guy to keep an eye on here. And just the depth. I mean, like, Pierre-Luc Dubois had a real good bounce-back season. This blue line is so incredibly deep. It's phenomenal blue line. And the goaltending, which, like I said last year, probably had the highest floor out of any tandem in the league, and I still relatively stand by that. I think it's close between them and Toronto. But I think that you have a very, very solid tandem of goalies here. There isn't really a ton missing from the Caps. I think, obviously you might want, another top-end forward here, but you could probably develop that with, somebody like a Ryan Leonard potentially. So the Capitals are really, really well set up to continue to be a threat here in the Eastern Conference, and they still have some players, coming up behind them. Their prospect pool isn't great, but it's not awful. So there's a lot to like about where Washington is right now, and it's gonna be interesting to see how this management team plays the next couple of years, like post Ovechkin. First of all, we'll see what happens with his contract extension. It seems like he might want to head back to Russia. And honestly, that might be like overall like for the best for the Capitals, because then they can fully invest in a brand new era for this team. But it's a question that's kind of looming over them. But until then, like, this team is still very, very good, and they're going to be ultra competitive. They're in a very tough division, very tough Eastern Conference. And I'm very intrigued to see what this team looks like. But for me, the Capitals are still a threat, and they're still a very viable threat in the Eastern Conference right now. And you look at their splits here, and 11th in forwards. I think this is the best blue line top to bottom in the NHL, despite the fact that they might not have the bona fide number one guy. I think the depth on this blue line is phenomenal. 7th in goaltending, again, like I said, one of the better tandems in the league. No clear starter, but I guess Logan Thompson now is the clear starter. He had a very solid season last year, but Charlie Lindgren can still be a very good 1B. 3rd on the special teams. Obviously, we know how good their power play is with Ovechkin. And 5th in coaching culture. I really like the overall group here that the Capitals have formed, and obviously, I said it a couple of times throughout these videos, but coaching culture also is affected by my overall predictions for the team. So they're obviously in the contender category. So that boosts their coaching culture up too. But overall, like, a really, really strong team, and a really underrated team, a team that didn't get a lot of attention last year for how good of a season they had, because all the attention went to Ovechkin. And I think that now that chase is over, we can kind of focus more on on the positives for what is a really, really well-rounded roster here with the Capitals. It starts with the management team here. I think, Chris Patrick, in his time in Washington, has done a really good job building this up. Now, he hasn't been there for very long, but, there's been, a couple of the buttons that he's pressed here so far have been very good. And then, of course, you got Spencer Carberry, who I think is maybe the most underrated coach in the NHL in terms of what he can do. I mean, the everybody that this team kind of plugs into their roster seems to just work. I mean, Pierre-Luc Dubois' comeback was great. We saw the Jacob Chychrun, not really renaissance, but I think he got a lot of flack in Ottawa, and most of that went away. I mean, Jacob Chychrun's one of my favorite defensemen in the NHL. Obviously, I have them in the fringe contender category, which is, on the verge of being in that top echelon. I think that they're, a tier below the true contenders in the NHL, but as we know how hockey works, right? Like if if you get yourself into the mix, the sport is random enough that you could see somebody pop out. And at the end of the year, if we're talking about the Capitals is in the Eastern Conference or Stanley Cup final, I wouldn't be overly surprised at that. I think that this team is more than good enough to go on a run. I think that they need a bit of help. I don't think they're as dominant of a force as like what we saw from the Panthers the last couple of years, but I definitely think that there's a world where that's the reality that we end the season with, and it starts with the management team. It's a management team that I trust, and that's a big part of the battle, right? When you're dealing with the matchup where you might be a little undermatched in terms of talent, the coaching can definitely get you over the hump, and I think Spencer Carberry's done a phenomenal job here, and I believe in what Chris Patrick's doing as the GM here as well. Look at their numbers last year. Obviously, we talked about it. Their offensive numbers were just phenomenal. Truly, truly phenomenal. Second in goals for, seventh in expected goals for. The blue line, or the defense, I guess, was a little bit more suspect. I think a lot of that comes down to the lack of true defensive forwards throughout especially the top 9 on this team. But clearly, I mean, last year it was fine, right? They still finished second in the league, and if you can outscore your opponents, I mean, they were fifth in goal share, ninth in expected goal share. So even with the lack of defense, they kind of made up for it with their offense, right? They were able to score a bunch of goals, and the Washington Capitals have been a team historically, especially throughout the 2010s, that massively outscored their expected goals numbers year over year, where they were middle of the pack expected goals team and would just consistently be in the top 3 or 4 in goals. And they're still a top 3 or 4 team in goals, but now they're also generating a ton of chances, and I think that that's and obviously a lot of that has to do with Ovechkin, but I really think if that's a formula they can continue building on, where they can still be a super effective scoring team. They're 6th in finishing last year, and they were 7th in expected goals. That's incredible. That's extremely rare to be that good of a finishing team and also generating that many chances. So it really does tell me this. It's more than just Ovechkin. Obviously, Alex Ovechkin's one of the best finishers we've ever seen in terms of just being a pure goal, sniper goal scorer. But it's everything else still coming together, where this team is just able to create chances now, but also capitalize on them. And I think that's easily this team's biggest strength. And it's been one of the criticisms I've had of the 2010s Capitals, and it's one of the reasons why I think they only won 1 Stanley Cup, despite being so astonishingly good as they were, because they just weren't generating enough chances throughout the playoffs to maximize their scoring potential. And it's a lot easier to match up well against a team that isn't generating a ton, right? It's the same problem the Rangers had for a couple of years. And I think that's one of the big reasons why the Capitals didn't have as much success in the 2010s as they probably could have. But now it seems like both those things are just kind of coming together, where they're generating a ton of chances, but they're also scoring at a very, very high rate. And that's a potent combination. And if that continues, I don't care if this team's middle of the pack defensively, because they're just going to be able to outscore all their problems and do it in a consistent way, do it in a way that I don't think is going to disappear in the postseason. That's what I think the Capitals are so good at. And yeah, the defense does worry me slightly, but I think there's very few teams that they could match up with that would cause them problems in that category. Jumping into this offense here, obviously, the headliner is going to be Alex Ovechkin, and a lot of people might not, I mean, like, I don't think Ovechkin is like the dynamic player he was before, right? He's not very good defensively. He very much is just his shot at this point, but his shot is so good that you still have to respect it overall, and that's why his grade is as high as it is, because of just how effective he is as a scorer. Now, do I think he's going to get as many looks as he did last year? Probably not. Now that the goal record is gone, I think that the Capitals can more focus on being more efficient than just having him shoot 12 times a game and hope that, you know, 2 of them go in the net. But I mean, as long as he's playing with you know, Dylan Strome, like, Dylan Strome is so good. He's one of the most underrated players in the NHL in terms of his playmaking ability. He is a phenomenal playmaker, and we saw that in parts. You know, while he was playing with Ovechkin, obviously Pierre-Luc Dubois got a lot of that time last year as well. But I really think that Dylan Strome is so underrated as a playmaker, and you can kind of throw him around with anybody, and he will boost up their goal totals just because of how creative he is with the puck. And we'll dive into him in a bit. But you look at the rest of this team. I mean, Tom Wilson is another guy that's just so underrated. And you talk about, you know, Connor McMichael and Ryan Leonard, who I both think are going to be key pieces for this team if they're going to take a step forward. You know, Anthony Beauvillier was brought in. You know, he looked solid. He looked better than I thought he was going to in Washington. Then you have, you know, Nick Dowd, and he's a really solid defender for the fourth line. And just overall, like, again, like, I think that this team is lacking that true, like, game breaking forward at this point. But they're so deep and they're so, like, well built without that I really don't think it's as big of a detriment as it would be to a lot of teams. I mean, again, this is a team that finished second in goals for, and what was it, 7th in expected goals for. I'm not really worried about that, right? It's not their offensive production isn't an issue. And so that's why I'm not really worried about them not having that top end guy. So yeah, their forward group ranks 11th, and that's one of the main reasons why. But I really don't think it's going to be a detriment to this team. I think the defensive play of this team is what could kill them. And I mean, you look around this roster, and it's really not like it. You know, aside from Tom Wilson, who's a solid defender, and Nick Dowd, there's really not a lot here to love defensively. You know, Pierre-Luc Dubois was fine last year, but you know, I there's not a ton to really sink your teeth into in terms of what this team can bring defensively, and that's definitely the biggest issue with the offense. Let's start with Alex Ovechkin, because Ovechkin is such a unique player, and like I said in the intro, it's the defense is non-existent, right? You watched him play last year, and I watched a lot of Capitals games as he was chasing the goal record. It was like the primary team I watched for the last 10 goals that he had to score, because, you know, history is fun to watch. But the just absolute disregard in the defensive zone was shocking, where he would literally just stand at the blue line with his stick in both hands around by his waist and just wait for the rest of the team to play defense. And it's for as many minutes as Ovechkin played, especially near in the last third of the season, it's actually incredible the Capitals were still middle of the pack defensive team, because they were essentially playing 5-on-4 whenever Alex Ovechkin was on the ice for that entire time, and he was playing about a third of a game by the end of it. So it was really, really funny to watch. And so obviously that's a big issue here for the Capitals, and there's no real denying that. It's just he's just not playing defense. He's not even he's trying and failing. He just doesn't care. And we saw him play. We saw him put a bit more effort in the playoffs, which is good. It showed that that's still there. That drive to win is still there, which is great. All the buzzwords are still kicking around with Ovechkin, but his real strength is the goal scoring, right? And there isn't a ton to say about this that people can't already piece together themselves. But he's still arguably the best scorer in the NHL right now. I think that there's debates in terms of production wise, but in terms of pure shot, sniper, he's such a unique player. He's one of a kind in that sense. He's obviously the greatest goal scorer in NHL history. I think that debate is pretty worn out at this point. Even before breaking the record, that really didn't do much for me in terms of elevating him, because he was already at that level. So that's his strength, right? He's going to be a spot up shooter who's guaranteed, if healthy, to get you 40 goals a season. I think that's that's a pretty fair assessment of where he is right now. And just having that threat on your top line, playing 20 minutes a night, being on both power play units, really, is enough of a deterrent for defensive play that I have to respect that and grade him the way that I did. Dylan Strome, like I talked about, man, like one of the most underrated playmakers in the NHL. Like just phenomenal playmaker. He is so good at not just like creating passes and like getting assists, but he's so good at putting the puck into areas that are going to be, dangerous situations. His cycle and forecheck offense is phenomenal, and it's because of his passing ability, right? It's because of his ability to get the puck around and move it and have play consistently moving in the offensive zone. And it's such a key skill to have, especially with how Washington runs their offense, especially with Alex Ovechkin on the ice, where it's very much a cycle spot up shot, trying to open that shot up for number 8. And Dylan Strome is so good at that. And like I was, harping on like 2 years ago, even when they brought in Dylan Strome, that like he should be the guy with Ovechkin immediately, and they've messed around with it a little bit. He's been on that line off and on. Dubois got a lot of that last year as well. But I did like just his ability to open up passing lanes because of his puck handling, because of how he's able to expand the game. It's so good. And you talk about his chance contributions being super high. His point shot setups are very high, and again, like that's a key way for how this team runs their offense. He's so good at those things. And I really think that like even if you do, like, you can split up him and Ovechkin, and they did it last year to very good success. And it does really allow this team to have like 2 lines of offense that can run in a similar way, which I think is good for development, because once Ovechkin leaves, you could still operate the offense in the same style, I guess is the best way to put it. So you're not like beholden to Alex Ovechkin to run the offense a specific way, and then you're running it different with everybody else because nobody else can run the offense that way. It's very much become a cycle, like slow, methodical team, because that's how they were built around their player. And it's cool to see that happen, because a lot of teams try to do that and it doesn't really work, and the Capitals have been experts at making the cycle game be very key for their offensive success. And Dylan Strome's great at it. Pierre-Luc Dubois had like a really impressive resurgence here, and I think Dubois gets a lot of crap because of the one bad year in LA. But and Pierre-Luc Dubois is such a unique player, because he'll have like a really strong season and then a down year, and then another really strong season and then another down year. And I think that's kind of the concern I have here, is I want to see him piece together multiple strong seasons. And last year his defensive numbers skyrocketed last season. His offensive production took a jump. His finishing still isn't great, but it went up as well last year. So I kind of want to see those things either even out, or because if he just plays the same way he did last year, like, he's a super good second line center. There's nothing wrong with that. But if he does have another down year and this up and down pattern continues, then there's really, at this point in his career, the fact that it's happened so many times, you kind of just have to accept that's just the way things are going to be. But you hope a player that's heading into their prime, who had a really strong season last year, who really didn't have a lot of pressure on them to succeed after the debacle that was the LA Kings run with Pierre-Luc Dubois. I really think that just having another consistent season, basically putting up the same numbers that he did last year, putting up the same underlying numbers that he did last year, will lock him into being, a really strong top 6 center. And I think that's got to be the goal here. I don't think that's a ton to ask for. I'm not asking for him to improve on last year, because last year was really solid and it's what they needed. But I want to see him be consistent year over year. And that's something that he's struggled with for his entire career. And we're on team number 4 now at 26 years old for a guy who was a top pick in the draft. It's weird, because it's not usually when you see that happen to a player, it's because they're a 4th liner and they completely busted. But like, That's not what happened to Pierre-Luc Dubois, right? He was moved for Patrick Laine, who was, at the time, it was a pretty big trade for both players. Both players were struggling a little bit, but both were still seen as the top-end players. And then obviously you had the trade from Winnipeg to LA, which was, again, for a very substantial package, because Pierre-Luc Dubois was supposed to be this really good player. And I guess the only time where he was really dumped was in the, the trade to Washington. But even then, like, the Capitals traded for him because they wanted him to be a top 6 player. And it's very rare to see a guy go to 4 different teams at age 26 and still be viewed as, that kind of top end player. And I think that this is really the year for me that's going to prove whether or not that's really who Pierre-Luc Dubois is, because he's been it. He was it last year. He was it 2 years ago in Winnipeg. He was certainly not that in LA. And, as much as I think LA was just a poor fit for him, and I didn't, you can go back to my Capitals preview last year where I stated as much. I said that, I just didn't think that, LA was a good fit for him stylistically. And Washington was a lot better. And, clearly after year one, that proved to be true, but the reality is that he's still been a very up and down player throughout his career. And I really need to see him put together two good years back to back. And then I'll fully believe that, he's worth basically what the contract is. And he can be that, that second line center here. Him and Dylan Strome can kind of be a 1A, 1B for the next little bit here in Washington. And for as many teams as we've talked about, if you watch this whole series, we've discussed how many teams are looking for a second line center. And if the Capitals can get a consistent Pierre-Luc Dubois and a consistent Dylan Strome, that 1-2 punch, it might not have the top end talent, but I think there's plenty of teams who are looking for second line centers right now who would gladly trade what they have for that tandem. Tom Wilson is another. Tom Wilson's so controversial because people just don't like him because he's kind of an asshole on the ice. But man, is he good? He is unbelievable on both ends of the ice. One of the better two-way forwards in the league still, which is crazy because he's 31 going on 32. There's still so much juice left here, I think. You worry a little bit about the longevity in terms of injuries and stuff. Kind of the argument with the Sam Bennett contract, where it's just eventually the style of play is just going to wear out on you, and a lot of the power forwards don't age well. But I mean, Tom Wilson's aging perfectly fine right now. He is phenomenal. His ability to create offense, create chances is fantastic because he gets to the net so much. So his expected numbers are a little bit inflated in that sense because a lot of his shots are coming very much from the Brady Tkachuk area, as we talked about in the Ottawa video. But still, I mean, he scores at a very, very consistent rate throughout his career, generates a ton of chances. Defensively, he's obviously very annoying to play against, but he's also very effective, which is a lot of people, and this is my power forward rant here for a second. This isn't about Tom Wilson at all. Tom Wilson's actually the opposite of what most people treat power forwards, right? But people love the big bodied guys who just hit and are tough and mean. But a lot of those guys are very ineffective and not very efficient at it. They just kind of throw their body around with reckless abandonment. But Tom Wilson is very selective isn't the right word because he does do that a lot, but he's a lot smarter about it. He does it in situations where it makes sense. And there's situations where he won't just throw his body at some guy to make a hit. He'll actually he'll play positional. He'll play positionally. And I really think that in terms of being a smart power forward, I don't know if there's a better one than Tom Wilson in the defensive zone. Just his ability to read plays properly and make the right call with how he's going to use his physicality is so rare. And it's a trait that a lot of people don't think of power forward just kind of having because they hit a lot, right? And if you look at just the stat line, Tom Wilson's a physical player, but the way that he does it is very, very effective. And I really respect that because the discourse around power forwards, especially from the analytics community, is that we just don't like them. And the reason why we don't like them is because they're not efficient and they don't do it in an effective manner. But Tom Wilson's the opposite of that. He's the exception to the rule, basically. And I very much respect the way that he plays defense because it's super effective and he does it in a very physical style, which is fun. Fans of the Capitals who are just kind of your old school yell shoot at the TV fans love him because he's fun to watch and he hits a lot. But kind of the more forward thinking new age fans like him too because he's very efficient and I think he's kind of like the perfect player for that. And it's hard, obviously, if you don't like the Capitals, to like Tom Wilson, but as somebody just trying to objectively look at every player in the league and dissect them and go through this whole analysis, Tom Wilson's great for that. Alexei Protas had a really, really insanely strong season last year, and he bursted onto the scene as a 23-year-old, just being this super effective, like, top six winger. And again, like, you look at his finishing just went from, it shot up from like 0 to 100 basically, in terms of like where he ranked in the NHL. His defense is whatever, stayed stable, and his offense has actually been consistently growing. So, when people a lot of times ask me for fantasy hockey advice, that's like a typical DM that I get on Instagram. Follow me on Instagram, by the way, NBA Hockey, link in the description. But a lot of people ask me about, like, especially for like dynasty leagues, like, should I hold on to this player or not? And I look at Protas' numbers, and yeah, his finishing percentage skyrocketed last year. Is that sustainable? He's 23. It's hard to say. His overall value skyrocketed last year. Is that sustainable? It's hard to say. His defense has stayed consistent. It stayed consistent year over year, so that's a good sign. But the thing that really makes me believe that, maybe he doesn't have like a top 5 finishing percentage season or whatever he ranked last season, but his offensive like production as a whole in terms of his expected numbers has actually grown pretty steadily. Like, there's a very easy pattern to follow there in terms of his growth. So I do think that, like, his stabilization in the top 6 is absolutely here to stay. Do I think that he has like the same amount of production that he had last year? Maybe not. But do I think that he's still a very, very good, like, do I think he'll be a mainstay top 6 forward now? Yeah, I do, because we've seen this pattern where it's like, yeah, he popped last season, but the development was there. Like, he was getting better every single season. So it's not like he just randomly had a crazy PDO season. This is like been building up. So it's almost like his PDO is averaged out over those seasons where, maybe, in 22, 23, and 23, 24, he was underperforming compared to what his expected numbers said he would, and now he overperformed for a season. So yeah, I think that the average of the last 2 seasons is probably what he is at this point, which is a very strong top 6 forward. And when you pair that with the playmaking and the skill set of the centers that this team has, I don't really have a ton of concerns about that. So the short answer to that is, if you're in a fantasy dynasty league and you have enough protection slots, I think this is a good buy for right now. There you go. This is your fantasy topic of the day in this video. Connor McMichael is an interesting player. He's an intriguing player because now he's starting to go from the young, exciting center, and he's still very young, right? Like, that's still like where he is. But now he's started to kind of establish himself as an NHL center now. And the thing that I like about where Connor McMichael is right now is there's not a ton of pressure on him because they have Pierre-Luc Dubois, and obviously if Dubois falters, you also have Connor McMichael, who I think can very much step up and be, a second-line center if needed next season based on what we've seen so far. And obviously you expect development to continue for him. But if Dubois has another strong season, then the pressure on Connor McMichael to like be the guy is like non-existent because he's the third center on this team. And that's like the perfect situation to develop a guy who might not have like an insane ceiling, right? Like, I don't think Connor McMichael is a top line center in the making in terms of being, a top 15 center in the NHL. Like, I think that's not going to happen. But the fact that he doesn't even have to think about that at all right now because he's the third best center on his team is very, very good for his development, right? You can slow burn him a little bit more. You can let him kind of ease into things. As this team kind of transitions from the Ovechkin era into this next wave, you've set yourself up in a very good way. And it's very similar to Ryan Leonard, who we're going to talk about, near the end of here with the forwards, where you can very much just kind of let those players develop on their own pace, essentially. You don't have to rush them in. you can kind of just ease them into the lineup, ease them into the system, let them get comfortable. And if they have, if they go above expectations, then fantastic. That's great. But you don't need that to be the case. Whereas some teams, right, you look at there's a couple of the teams that we've talked about, before this that are kind of in that middle area, who are very much relying on their young players to get them into this next level. Washington can take their time with these guys. I think that's going to be important because I don't think the ceilings on the hit potential on both McMichael and Ryan Leonard isn't like guaranteed. So giving them time to develop and not rushing them into a situation where they have to be the most important player to get this team into the playoffs, it's very good. I do like both players. This isn't me saying that they both suck. That's not the thing I want to get out of this. But I like Connor McMichael. I think he's very good. He's very good on both ends of the ice already. And he's going to be given time to mature. And that is insanely key for players like this. And if they do it right, then, that next wave of players as, this guard kind of moves out, should transition insanely nicely. Nick Dowd I want to touch on here because Nick Dowd is fun. He doesn't get talked about a ton. His offensive production isn't great. It's fine, pretty pedestrian. But his defensiveness is phenomenal. He is a fantastic, bottom of the lineup, low event center. He's played some pretty big minutes. I mean, he was, playing F2 type minutes in 24-25 in a lot of cases. But he's a guy who can throw around up and down the lineup. He's very much a Swiss Army knife. You'd rather him be, that defensive center guy you can throw over the boards when you have a lead and just need nothing to happen. But he does have a bit of an offensive touch to him too, so he can, he can produce. It's not like he's non-existent offensively. And, players like Nick Dowd I've talked about kind of throughout this series. They're guys that I really like because they're undervalued. They're unsung guys. People think that, fourth line centers can grow on trees. Because there's a lot of them, but there's not very many good ones. I think that's a very, very interesting thing, with guys in this role, right? Is there's a ton of guys who are like talented enough to be in the NHL, and people think fourth line center is a fringe NHLer, but there's very few guys who have actually like made careers out of being bottom of the lineup guys, right? Like those are very rare players, and Nick Dowd is absolutely one of them. And I think that's a very strong trait because you have that stability of a guy here, who what you're going to get out of is very, very safe defensively. And for a team like Washington, whose biggest weakness here has been defensive consistency, having guys like Nick Dowd is going to be valuable to this team. And I'm a big fan. I think that he's great. Finally, Ryan Leonard, who, again, if you're looking at this on YouTube, I have the JFresh NHLE card. I don't love NHLE. I think it's an insanely flawed stat, but in terms of grading out prospects across the board, it's about the best that we have, so take that with a grain of salt. But even then, I mean, he ranks 48th in terms of projected chance of becoming a star, according to this, and 57th in full-time NHLer. Obviously, he's going to be a full-time NHLer this year, so there you go. That's kind of what I mean, though. I think that the Ryan Leonard hit potential isn't as high as people might think it is because he was the top 10 pick, but the reality is that very few top 10 picks actually turn out to be top line forward superstars. That doesn't normally happen, right? If Ryan Leonard develops into a middle six forward who plays 10 years in the NHL, that's a good pick, right? People overvalue high picks because they expect them all to people talk listen to the draft this year, okay? This isn't me trashing on Ryan Leonard. This is just a philosophical conversation we're gonna have. I like Ryan Leonard. I think he's gonna have a really strong season. Do I think that he's gonna be a breakout first line 70-point guy this year? Probably not. Do I think he's going to be very effective? Do I think he might be able to play into the top six, take the Bevelier spot? Yeah, maybe. I think he's going to get an opportunity to do that. That's my conversation with Ryan Leonard. Let's talk philosophically, big picture about players like Ryan Leonard who come in, have a lot of excitement about them, especially U.S. players, right? There's this aura about coming out of college and signing late into the season and playing, right? That CHL players just don't have. Listen to how people talk about a mid first round pick in this year's draft, right? Listen to the Athletic podcast or the Dauber prospects stuff or elite prospect stuff, when you read their stuff, they'll talk about a guy that's going to go like 18th overall and be like, yeah, he can be a good middle six forward. Like, go back in the last decade of drafts and tell me how many guys were taken 18th, 19th overall that turned out to be good middle six forwards. I guarantee the number is less than 20, which is the number of guys who have been taken in that spot who were said to be, pretty safe middle six forwards. It doesn't happen, right? The vast majority of guys taken in the top 10 turn out to be those guys because that's just how development works. So this idea, and it's not just Ryan, like I'm not trying to trash on Ryan Leonard. He's just the guy that is in this conversation, right? Again, I think Ryan Leonard's going to be a top six forward. That's not the point of this. The point is this. Whenever guys go in the top 10 and step into the NHL, the immediate reaction from fans is, oh my God, this guy's going to be the next Sidney Crosby, or he's going to be the next, maybe Sidney Crosby is a bit much. He's going to be the next like Steven Stamkos or John Tavares, who's just going to be like a top pick, first line kind of guy, like maybe not, the best in the world, but somebody who's really good. And the vast majority of the time, that's not what happens. The vast majority of the time, they turn out to be, a solid second liner, sometimes a third liner, but they turn out to be like a good, solid NHL career guy. And that's good. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that the mindset around these top players needs to kind of change, right? The idea that like if somebody's taken in the top 10, they have to be, a number one forward on a team is unfair to the players. And it's unfair to guys like Ryan Leonard because I don't necessarily see Ryan Leonard being a, top of the lineup, like number one scorer on a team. Like that's just not how I projected him to go. Can he become that? Sure. But people need to understand the expectation behind a top 10 pick is vastly overvalued around the NHL. And that's just, do yourself an experiment. If you're watching this video, go back to the last 10, 15 years of the draft. Look through the top 10, like between like 7 and 12, let's say in the draft, and look at how many of those players actually turned out to be like number one guys on a team, like top line, strong number one guys. There's going to be players in there. I'm not denying the fact that those players don't exist, but it's a lot rarer than everybody thinks it will be the day of the draft, and people just forget that every year for some reason. I like Ryan Leonard. I think he's going to be good. There you go. There's my little caveat for all the comments I'm going to get over my rant, but it's not about Ryan Leonard. I don't think Ryan Leonard's bad. This blue line, man. Oh my God. This blue line is I love this blue line so much. John Carlson is still a very, very effective offensive defenseman. Despite what people will tell you about the fact that he's old and his numbers might not be as good as they used to be, he's still a very, very effective top-line offensive defenseman. And he fits what this team does exceptionally well. He's very, very good as a cycle offensive defenseman. Jakob Chychrun is the real X factor on this blue line because if you've followed me for any length of time, you know how much I love Jakob Chychrun and how much I think that he is just undervalued around the NHL, and the fact that he was traded basically for a significantly worse defenseman in terms of talent kind of proves that to me. But he's great. But you look at the rest of this, I mean, Rasmus Sandin is just like, he's got so much potential, right? Like when he came to Washington, like the stretch that he had post-trade deadline when he was in Washington, he was the best defenseman on the team. And he still has a ton of that left. Now, I think that he's probably going to cap out as, a second pair defenseman. But as a second pair offensive defenseman who's very good in transition, very good at getting the puck out of their own zone, that's a very good strength to have as a defenseman. And he's like the fifth most important defenseman on this team, right? Like, Matt Roy is a strong defensive defenseman. I think that the price tag they paid for Matt Roy was higher than I probably would have. But again, this team needed defense help, and Matt Roy can certainly do that. Trevor Van Riemsdyk is an incredibly underrated defensive defenseman. And then you have Martin Fehervary, who's just kind of your jack of all trades, sixth defenseman who can kind of get plugged all the way around this lineup. Like, yes, the Capitals don't have, the Cale Makar defenseman on this team, right? But in terms of like filling out all the boxes, checking off all the boxes for what I want for a blue line, I don't like. There isn't a better blue line in the NHL. I think that the floor on this blue line is so high. Like, I think the floor at the end of the season, if everybody's healthy, right, barring an injury to John Carlson and Jakob Chychrun, the lowest I could see myself ranking this blue line if it's together next season would be like fifth. And I don't know if there's another team in the league that I can say that for. it's so like the floor on this team is so exceptionally high that the ceiling doesn't need to be that high. And I think that their ceiling isn't except like I think that I would be hard pressed at the end of the year to say that it's still the best blue line in the league, if that makes sense, because there's enough boom potential on a couple of the other teams that are in the top 4 or 5, but there's really no need for this team to have a ton of boom, and they still do. I mean, Rasmus Sandin could develop into a top line defender by the end of the year. Like, that could happen, right? Like, there's still a lot of growth left there, right? Jacob Chychrun could take another step forward. So there's so much potential in this blue line, and there's so much talent, I guess, not necessarily potential, but so much like just it works really well. It meshes extremely well. I love the mix of players. I think that the skill sets this blue line has is exactly what I would want in a blue line. Yeah, they lack the super top end dynamic defender, but John Carlson really fits what this team wants to do. So even though he isn't, Cale Makar, he's still super effective, and the rest of the blue line is just insanely deep. And let's talk about John Carlson, because, man, like, the offensive numbers for John Carlson year over year are incredible. And year over year, he doesn't get talked about at all as a super effective, play-driving offensive defenseman. I think it's a lot because he doesn't score at the rate that, like, a Cale Makar or Quinn Hughes or even, like, Erik Karlsson does, right? Like, his finishing isn't good. And I think that's why he doesn't get looked at in that group. But I think it's time that we start. Like, I'm going to start the John Carlson as an elite offensive defenseman discourse, like, now. Like, it's happening. He's so good. And his power play numbers are phenomenal. He's a great power play quarterback. Yeah, it helps that he plays with Alex Ovechkin every time that he's on the ice. But it's just, he's so good at just being, getting the puck out of his zone, first of all, is key, right? Now, his defensive numbers aren't very good. He did have a better year last year than in the past, but his defensive stuff isn't great. It really, really is coming down to just being able to be that playmaker, that setup guy on that offense. And he basically is the quarterback of the offense in the offensive zone too, where that's not usually how teams run their offenses now. It's a lot of times either the low winger or the center who's kind of like your distributor at 5-on-5. But John Carlson's just kind of doing it all the time. I mean, and he was, even to a point, even in like the Nick Backstrom years, he was, a lot of the times he was that facilitator leading to the Backstrom passes, leading to the Ovechkin goals. And he's kind of just been able to morph into that now. So, like, 83rd percentile in primary assists is kind of the proof of that still existing. All I'm saying is, when you're watching Capitals games, watch the impact that John Carlson has on the offense, because it's so underappreciated, because he's not scoring goals at the rate of some of the other top-end, offensive defensemen, but he's very much still extremely important to how that offense runs. And that's all I want to say on Carlson. I love John Carlson. Let's get some respect for John Carlson still being a top-end offensive defenseman right now. The other guy I want to talk about, man, is Jacob Chychrun, who is like, oh my God, Jacob Chychrun is, there's still not enough discourse around how good he is in terms of like what he does. He does all the little things exceptionally well. And the problem with Chychrun that I think comes up is that he does a lot of the small things exceptionally well and has his entire career. But I think that there's a lot of hesitancy from fans because those little things haven't turned into they haven't turned into the macro production yet. He hasn't been a point a game defender. He hasn't been, in the top end of points for defenders, right? So it's like people think about John Carlson or Jacob Chychrun and they're like, yeah, he's good, but he's not, he's not like on a Norris level, and I'm not saying that he should be, but a lot of the conception around how good a defenseman comes in, or how good a defenseman is, especially from the offensive side, is very much tied to their point productions. And I think that, like, in a way that's a little unfair, because first of all, if you're a defenseman, like, the vast majority of the time you're getting secondary assists on breakouts, or at least when you're leading to chances, they're coming off, a breakout pass that you send up to your center who eventually passes it. In the offense, the whole thing, I could make a whole video on why points for defensemen are a poor way of
judging their offensive, but it doesn't matter. Jakob Chychrun is undervalued in my mind because he does those little things really well, but it doesn't necessarily show up, right? He's never really had to be the guy since he was traded out of Arizona, and when he was the guy in Arizona, nobody cared because it was Arizona. It was kind of like this, like the idea of Jakob Chychrun was bigger than who Jakob Chychrun was because people just didn't really care because it was Arizona. And then he went to Ottawa, and obviously they had Thomas Chabot there, and then Jake Sanderson stepped up and kind of leapfrogged him in the lineup, and that's why he was expendable. And now in Washington, like he's the closest he's been to being the number one guy, and I think by the end of this year he probably will be. But John Carlson's still there, and he's still super effective as their primary offensive defenseman, as we just talked about. I think that's why Jakob Chychrun doesn't get the love that I think he probably should. And I think moving into this next era here, the Capitals do have their number one guy. Like I'm fully convinced that Jakob Chychrun can take that mantle even as soon as this season and become the Capitals' like number one defenseman. Matt Roy, as I talked about, like I think that his contract is expensive for what he is. I think that his top peak was in LA. But in saying that, he's still a pretty decent, offensive guy. He's not going to be a bad offensive defenseman. His value does come from the defensive side. I think that he's good. I think that, for instance, like the data that I have up on screen right now is from Evolving Hockey. I think that they underrate him. I think they're the way that they calculate their expected goals model and their GAR models underrate what Matt Roy is defensively. It's a whole nother, again, that's a philosophical thing. I can get into that if people are interested, but it's really boring math calculation stuff. I do think like as like the fourth most important defenseman on this team, Matt Roy is very good for that role, right? Maybe he's even like less important than the fourth most important guy, right? If you want to say that Trevor Van Riemsdyk, who's a better overall defender, is more important than Matt Roy is like the fifth most important player on this blue line, like go for it. Like he's one of the best number fours in the NHL, and he'd be easily the best number five if that's how you want to look at it, right? Like I think that he's slightly overpaid for what he is. I think that his value does get overstated a little bit in terms of like being this great blue liner, because like the analytics community was super high on him when he was in LA, and they freaked out when he got signed, and so did I. But the overall like what what they need him to be, what the Capitals need Matt Roy to be, is so like smaller than even his contract states. Like it's good. Like I said, if Matt Roy's like your fourth or fifth best defenseman at the end of the year, like you're doing really good. Like that's insane, right? Like if you watch the series forever, like Matt Roy is a top 2 to 3 defenseman on like the vast majority of teams that we've talked about already, and he's like 4, maybe 5 on the Capitals. That's what I'm saying with this blue line. But Matt Roy's good. I mean, he does help this team defensively, which is their biggest need. He doesn't do a ton offensively that really like sparks excitement in me. But overall, like I think that he's an exceptional option as a number 4 or 5 guy. Rasmus Sandin, I love, and I've been a Rasmus Sandin lover for a very, very long time, and it's really because of the zone entries, right? Like his ability to control the possession while entering the zone is maybe the best in the league in terms of defensemen. Like he's up there for sure. But again, like a very good cycle forecheck defender, right? Like you're seeing a pattern here, right? Like it's very much they're looking for those guys who are good in cycle, good with possession. Rasmus Sandin's biggest strength, obviously, is getting the puck into the zone with possession, so that can kind of create those cycle opportunities. He's very much not a transition, like rush offense defender or creator. But they don't need him to be, because that's not how the Capitals run their offense. But again, like he's a guy who gets the puck out of the zone really well. He's very good in retrievals. His defending zone entries is poor. But in terms of being like a secondary, like a light version of what Jakob Chychrun is, basically, I think that Rasmus Sandin is a very good option for that. And again, like we're talking about a guy who might be the fourth most important player on the team. right? Like this is such a abundance of riches, right? Like we can nitpick Rasmus Sandin's game, but the fact is that like they're not going to put him in situations where he needs to be the number one guy. They're not going to put him in situations that don't fit his style because they have so many other options for players they can put in those situations. And that's what I love about this blue line is there issues in Matt Roy's game? Yes. Is there issues in Rasmus Sandin's game? Yes. Is there issues in Trevor Van Riemsdyk, Martin Fehervari's games? Yes. But this team is so versatile and they're so deep and they have so many different players who can fit different roles that like those issues are very rarely going to come out. And they can really focus on what each of those guys does well. And I think this is where Spencer Carberry's strength is, because we saw this last year with this blue line where he was able to put his players out in situations where they could be the most effective. And he was getting the best out of these players because he had that he had such an abundance of riches in terms of what he could do with the blue line. And so, yeah, like there's deficiencies in Rasmus Sandin. There's deficiencies in Matt Roy. There's deficiencies in all these guys. But the mix of players they have helps cover those deficiencies so well. And Spencer Carberry is so good at putting those players into situations where they aren't going to be facing something that's going to be too hard for them to handle, that it does create this ecosystem of just everybody's able to play to their best level. And Rasmus Sandin still has room to grow. Do I think he becomes like a number one defender? No, I probably think that he doesn't become a number two guy either. I think that ship might have sailed, but as a true number three, like really, really good number three, I think that door is still wide open and he might already be there. Trevor Van Riemsdyk, like I said, super elite defender, has been for the last 2 years. His offensive numbers have deteriorated. I mean, he is 33, going on 34. I think that's fair. That's a fair assessment to have. But for a $3 million defender, being one of the best defenders in the NHL, do I think those numbers are going to deteriorate substantially over this next season? No. And again, like he's a bottom pair defender, one of the best third pair defenders in the NHL, or one of the best third pair defensemen in the NHL. Very good on the penalty kill as well. But just, again, shutdown guy. Nothing's going to happen while he's on the ice. Even if the offensive numbers still deteriorate, $3 million is nothing for a guy who's going to add insane stability to the back end. Martin Fehervary is kind of the similar, like he's very much a jack of all trades player, a guy that can get thrown up and down the lineup. He's solid offensively. He has decent defensive numbers. He can bounce around. I think that's a very unique trait to him. Now, is he like exceptional in any area? No. But just the fact that he can play kind of up and down the lineup is very strong. I mean, his penalty kill numbers aren't great, but they're not egregious. He doesn't play on the power play, so I guess that's an area that they can't, but they have a bunch of other guys who can. Just having this one guy who's like probably the sixth defenseman on this team be able to bounce up and down the lineup in case of injury or in case of like somebody's having an off night, whatever, is incredibly important. And I think that the value of that is understated. And again, because of how good this blue line is, you can afford to have a player who can just kind of be a utility knife on on your blue line. And that's what Martin Fehervary is to me. Again, he's not exceptional anywhere, but he can fill holes if necessary. And having that as your kind of final guy on the blue line is great. Like that's amazing to have as your quote unquote worst defenseman. Like there's really no sheltering that needs to happen on this blue line that can't be sheltered very easily. Finally, net, I mean, Logan Thompson and Charlie Lindgren, like I said, might be the best tandem in terms of like top to bottom talent, in terms of like how high the floor is for this team. And again, like I talked about it last year where I liked this tandem a lot, and I thought that their floor was really low, even if one of them struggles. And Charlie Lindgren had a down season last year, and guess what? They finished the second best team in the NHL. So like that's what I was talking about, where like one of them can have a bad season, and it doesn't really affect them all that much. Now, Is there a world where they can both have a bad season and it becomes an issue? Then yeah, but if both your goalies are having bad seasons, then like I don't care who you are, that's not a good place to be. But I do think that we see a bit of a bounce back from Charlie Lindgren. I'd expect it. He obviously dealt with some injury stuff. And Logan Thompson, I mean, obviously, if he continues to kind of on the trajectory that he's been on, he's gonna be really good and can continue to develop into a true starting goaltender. We look at their numbers from the last 2 years. I mean, they both played 89 games, so it's pretty easy to compare these two. I mean, their numbers are actually insanely similar. It's crazy how similar these two goalies. Right? We talked about it with Vejmelka and Connor Ingram in Utah, but like Charlie Lindgren and Logan Thompson, like their numbers over the last 2 seasons are insanely identical, right? 89 games played, 255.4 expected goals against for Charlie Lindgren, 255.22 for Logan Thompson, 90.47 save percentage for Charlie Lindgren, 90.83 for Logan Thompson. Their Finnick save percentages, 83.88 versus 83.86 in favor of Charlie Lindgren, and their goal save above expected is where there's a bit of a difference here. Again, I can get into the philosophical reasons as to why, but basically the difference between them is the 0.4 difference in save percentage is why there's a bigger gap. But because goal saved above expected is a counting stat and save percentage isn't, it averages out to being an extra whatever it is 7 goals that Logan Thompson has saved above expected compared to Charlie Lindgren. So if you want to understand why all their numbers look identical except for that, it's because that minute difference in goal saved above or in save percentage quantified over 89 games leads to the extra couple goals saved above expected for Logan Thompson. But again, like their numbers are identical, like it's insane. And again, like I said in the Utah video, having that consistency year over year for each of these teams, for the team in front of you, is so important to create consistency with the forward core, create like consistent game planning. You don't have to play a different way when your backup's in, right? It's something that we're going to talk about with like some of the teams at the top here, right? Like we'll talk about when we get to the Jets, how the team has to play different in front of Connor Hellebuyck compared to, Eric Comrie. And for Washington, they really don't need to do that. And having that stability, even though the ceiling on either of these goaltenders is obviously going to be lower than that, I don't expect either of these goalies to win the Vezina next year. The floor of just being able to play the same way every single night is actually such an advantage. Finally, the special teams. Like I said, it's a good unit. There's really no major downside. I think that in terms of a second unit, it's actually one of the better ones in the league. Obviously, Alex Ovechkin was on both. I don't know if they're going to do that all the time anymore because, he's not chasing the goal record, but he doesn't have to move, so it's not like he's expending energy, standing at the top of the circle waiting for somebody to pass him the puck. But I think that the penalty kill is actually really, really underrated. Matt Roy, for as much of a pedestrian 5-on-5 numbers he puts up, is one of the best penalty killers in the league. Nick Dowd is also a very good penalty killer. Alexei Protas is a very good penalty killer. Trevor Van Riemsdyk's phenomenal. Both goalies are exceptional on the penalty kill, with Charlie Lindgren being better in that sense. But overall, it's a very strong special teams unit on both ends of the puck. So there you have it. That is team number 8 on my preseason power rankings, the Washington Capitals. Let me know what you think of Washington down below. I think they're one of the better teams in the NHL. I think they could have another really strong year. Like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if them or any of the teams from here on out end up in the Stanley Cup final. I think we're in that range at this point. Washington's obviously at the lower end of that, just because of the defense and the lack of a true game-breaking offensive player. But I think that over the course of the season, the Capitals are going to be one of the best teams in the league. But let me know what you think down below, and we'll see you very shortly for team number 7.